The blinding lights of the Manhattan ballroom washed over me, casting a warm golden glow across the hundreds of industry titans seated at the banquet tables below. I stood at the center of the massive stage, the heavy crystal trophy resting firmly in my hands. The engraved letters on the glass read, "Top 10 Fintech Disruptors of the Year." The applause was deafening, a roaring wave of validation that drowned out the quiet, persistent doubts that had plagued me for the past 5 years. I offered the crowd a bright, practiced smile, projecting the absolute certainty and power of a successful Black woman who had just conquered one of the most ruthless sectors in the technology industry. I had spent countless nights coding until my fingers cramped, pitching to venture capitalists who looked right through me and fighting for every single inch of space in boardrooms where nobody expected me to survive. This award was the tangible proof that my financial technology platform, a system designed to revolutionize microlending for marginalized communities, was not just a viable idea, but a dominant force in the market. Yet as I stood there soaking in the standing ovation from strangers who respected my intellect, my eyes remained locked on the very front row of the VIP section. Right in the center of the velvet-roped area sat 3 empty chairs. The crisp white place cards resting on the plush black fabric clearly displayed the names of the only guests I had personally invited to share this milestone. Warren, Brenda, and Jasmine, my father, my mother, and my older sister. They had promised me they would be here. They had sworn they would take the short 2-hour flight from Atlanta to New York to finally support my career. I had personally paid for their first-class tickets. I had booked them a luxury corner suite overlooking Central Park at the Plaza Hotel. I had even arranged for a private town car to bring them directly to the venue so they would not have to worry about navigating the city traffic. Yet the chairs remained painfully, undeniably empty. The physical ache, tightening in my chest, was a sensation I had known intimately since childhood. Growing up in the affluent, highly competitive neighborhood of Buckhead in Atlanta, our family projected an image of flawless traditional success. My father, Warren, was a titan in the logistics industry. He built his trucking and freight empire from the ground up and firmly believed that brutal, relentless capitalism was the only religion worth practicing. He valued aggressive expansion, tangible assets, and the kind of old-school business tactics that left little room for innovation or emotion. My mother, Brenda, was the ultimate Southern socialite, dedicating her entire existence to maintaining our family reputation within the elite circles of Black high society. She cared deeply about appearances, country club memberships, and curating an image of domestic perfection. And then there was Jasmine. Jasmine was the undeniable golden child, 3 years older than me and utterly perfect in my parents' eyes. She was a former pageant queen who possessed a superficial glittering charm that effortlessly commanded any room she entered. She never had to work hard for anything because everything was simply handed to her on a silver platter. I was her exact opposite. I was the quiet, deeply analytical daughter who preferred writing complex lines of code over attending lavish country club mixers. My parents viewed my ambitions as a confusing, isolating embarrassment. I clearly remembered the day I won the state mathematics championship in high school. I stood on a gymnasium stage, holding a plastic medal, desperately searching the crowded bleachers for my parents. They had skipped the academic competition to help Jasmine pick out a designer dress for a charity gala. I remembered my college graduation day. I earned a dual degree in computer science and finance, graduating at the top of my class. But my father spent the entire celebratory dinner complaining about the campus parking and constantly checking his watch because he had a golf game scheduled with his business partners. Tonight was supposed to be different. I had built a technology platform that processed millions of transactions and truly helped people. I was being recognized on a national level by the most prestigious publications in the world. I foolishly thought this would finally be the moment they saw my worth, the moment they acknowledged my hard work and welcomed me as an equal. I smiled one last time for the flashing cameras, murmured my sincere gratitude into the microphone, and walked off the stage. The heavy crystal trophy felt like a block of ice in my hands. The event coordinator patted my shoulder and congratulated me enthusiastically as I moved past the heavy velvet curtains into the quiet backstage corridor. The muffled sound of the gala continued behind me, creating a stark contrast to the ringing, lonely silence in my ears. I walked down the dimly lit hallway until I found a secluded, empty alcove. I set the trophy on a small decorative table and pulled my phone from my evening clutch. The screen was dark. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages saying they were running late or stuck in traffic or held up by an emergency. There was absolutely nothing. Then, a social media notification suddenly popped up on my screen. Jasmine had just posted a new photo. My finger hovered over the glass screen for a second before I tapped the notification. The image loaded, and the remaining breath was knocked completely out of my lungs. It was a picture of my family sitting at a lavish, sprawling table at the Piedmont Country Club in Atlanta. The table was covered in expensive champagne bottles, crystal glassware, and massive silver platters of seafood. In the center of the frame sat Trent, Jasmine's husband. Trent was a white finance bro who ran a boutique private equity fund. He wore a pastel polo shirt and a smug, incredibly entitled grin. Jasmine was leaning heavily against him, holding a champagne flute, looking perfectly styled and radiantly happy. My mother and father sat across from them, their faces glowing with immense, unadulterated pride. My father was actually raising his glass toward Trent in a toast. The caption underneath the photo read, "Celebrating Trent securing a massive new wealth management client today. So proud of my brilliant husband. Family supports family." The utter hypocrisy of those three words burned my eyes. Family supports family. They had abandoned the biggest night of my professional life, a night that recognized my genuine, hard-earned innovation, to sit at a country club and stroke the ego of a man whose entire career was built on aggressive networking and leveraging family connections. I stared at the photo, zooming in on my father's wide, proud smile. It was a look of pure approval that he had never once directed at me. I felt a hot, familiar wave of anger rising in my throat. I did not want to cry. I was completely exhausted from shedding tears over people who deliberately chose not to see me. I hit the call button on my mother's contact name. The phone rang 3 long times before she finally answered. The loud, brassy sound of a live jazz band echoed through the receiver, mixed with the clinking of glasses and loud, boisterous laughter. "Hello," Brenda answered, her voice slightly slurred and elevated from the champagne. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice dangerously steady and quiet. "Where are you right now?" "Oh, Sydney," she said, not sounding guilty or apologetic in the slightest. "We are at the club. Trent closed a huge deal today. We simply had to celebrate his success. We tried to call you earlier, but we figured you were busy with your little computer event." "You did not try to call me," I replied smoothly, gripping the phone tighter. "And it is not a little computer event. It is a major national industry award. I had front row seats waiting for you. You promised you would be here tonight. Sydney, please do not start with the dramatic guilt trips." Brenda sighed, her tone instantly shifting from celebratory to aggressive annoyance. "Your little banking app is cute, but you need to understand adult priorities. Trent just secured a multi-million-dollar portfolio. He is playing in the big leagues now. Your brother-in-law is the financial backbone of this family's future. You have to learn to look at the bigger picture and stop being so incredibly jealous of your sister's happiness." The words hit me like physical blows, but they also brought a blinding, brilliant clarity. My banking app, as she so dismissively called it, was a proprietary financial technology platform that processed millions of dollars in transactions daily. But to my mother, because I was a Black woman doing the quiet, invisible work of coding and building complex back-end systems, my intense labor was dismissed as a cute little hobby. Meanwhile, Trent, a mediocre white man who simply moved other people's money around and attended golf luncheons, was treated like a financial deity. The glaring contrast in their treatment of us was a historical pattern of blatant, unapologetic disrespect. 4 years ago, when I was desperately building the prototype for my platform, I ran out of money for basic server space. I went to my father and asked for a $5,000 loan. I presented him with a comprehensive business plan, detailed projected revenue models, and a clear, highly structured repayment schedule. My father had literally laughed in my face. He told me I was completely delusional. He told me I should quit playing games on the computer and get a real job in the accounting department of his logistics company. He refused to give me a single dime, claiming he did not waste his hard-earned money on fairy tales. Yet less than a year later, when Trent wanted to aggressively expand his private equity fund, my father gladly co-signed a massive commercial loan without demanding to see a single financial projection or risk analysis. My father blindly trusted Trent simply because Trent spoke the arrogant language of Wall Street and wore an expensive tailored suit. "Mom," I said, leaning against the cool wall of the alcove. "My app is not a hobby. I am building a real substantial company. You chose to skip my award ceremony for a casual dinner party." "Oh, grow up," Sydney Brenda snapped, raising her voice over the swelling jazz music. "We are your family, but we are not going to cater to your desperate need for attention every time you get a plastic participation trophy. Trent is doing real tangible business that secures our social standing in this city. If you cannot be happy for your family's prosperity, then maybe you need to seriously reevaluate your bitter attitude. We will talk when you get back to Atlanta. Assuming you can afford the flight home. Have a good night." The line went dead. The silence in the backstage corridor was absolute and suffocating. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, staring at the darkened screen. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, aching sadness that had plagued me for 31 years completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard, and absolute logical resolve. They honestly believed I was still the desperate, struggling girl begging for their basic approval. They honestly believed Trent was the sole financial savior of our entire family tree. They had absolutely no idea what I had actually been doing for the last 5 years. Nor did they comprehend the magnitude of the empire I had quietly built while they were busy looking the other way. I opened the email application on my phone. I searched for the specific draft message I had saved 2 days ago. It was addressed to the senior financial editor at Forbes magazine. The editor had been contacting my public relations team for weeks, begging me to authorize the official release of my company's latest financial disclosures for their upcoming global tech issue. I had hesitated for days, wanting to keep my rapidly growing wealth private, deeply fearing that public exposure would change the family dynamic in aggressive ways I was not ready to handle. I realized in that quiet hallway that I was utterly foolish to protect the fragile feelings of people who did not care about mine. I deleted my previous hesitant, polite response. I typed a single decisive sentence. "You have my full authorization to publish the Series B valuation data and the feature article immediately." I hit send without a second thought. I picked up my heavy crystal trophy from the small table. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a perfectly forged weapon. I walked out of the venue, hailed a passing cab to the airport, and flew back to Atlanta. I was done waiting for a seat at their crowded, dismissive table. I was going to buy the whole damn building. Exactly 1 week later, the digital and financial world completely exploded. I sat in my expansive corner office on the top floor of a sleek glass high-rise in Midtown Atlanta. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding, sweeping view of the sprawling city I was about to conquer. At precisely 9 in the morning, Forbes dropped their highly anticipated global technology issue. My face was featured prominently on the digital cover. I was wearing a sharp, tailored emerald green suit, my arms crossed confidently, looking directly into the camera with unapologetic absolute power. The bold, glaring headline beneath my photograph read, "The $99 million Series B Fintech Queen." The comprehensive article detailed absolutely everything. It exposed exactly how my proprietary platform had captured a massive, unprecedented share of the microlending market. It outlined my aggressive, flawless expansion strategy. It highlighted the fierce, cutthroat bidding war between major venture capital firms that ultimately ended with top-tier investors pouring tens of millions of dollars into my company. The financial world was officially put on notice, and the validation was staggering. My employees were cheering loudly in the open bullpen outside my office doors. My corporate inbox was flooding endlessly with congratulatory messages from industry leaders, potential global partners, and major media outlets requesting exclusive interviews. My phone rang non-stop. I ignored all of it. I was waiting for one specific, inevitable reaction. I sat at my wide mahogany desk, calmly sipping a black coffee, watching the minutes tick by on the digital clock in the corner of my computer screen. 10 minutes passed, 20 minutes passed, 30 minutes passed. They were probably waking up in their Buckhead mansion, pouring their morning coffee, casually scrolling through their curated news feeds. Then, exactly 34 minutes after the explosive article went live, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the wood of my desk. The screen lit up with a new text message. It was from Warren. My father had not initiated a direct text conversation with me in over 2 full years. I picked up the phone and read the brief, demanding message. Family dinner at 6:30 p.m. tonight at the house. We need to have an important wealth management discussion. Your presence is absolutely mandatory. Do not be late. I read the message 3 times to ensure I was not hallucinating. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the man was breathtaking to witness. For years, he had treated me like an embarrassing financial burden. He had called my technical ambitions a pathetic joke. He had callously refused to invest $5,000 in my future when I desperately needed it. I had skipped my major award ceremony to drink expensive champagne with his thoroughly mediocre son-in-law. But the very second, a highly respected financial magazine attached a $99 million valuation to my name, I was suddenly urgently summoned for an important wealth management discussion. He did not say congratulations. He did not say he was proud of my achievements. He immediately viewed my hard-earned wealth as a communal family asset that desperately needed to be managed, most likely by the very men he deemed inherently superior. I did not reply to the text message. I placed the phone face down on my desk, ensuring the screen was hidden. I stood up smoothly and walked over to a large, vibrant, abstract painting hanging on the far wall of my private office. I pulled the heavy frame aside, revealing a reinforced steel wall safe hidden securely in the concrete. I entered the complex security code, turned the cold metal handle, and pulled the heavy door open. Inside the dark safe rested a thick, meticulously organized legal folder holding several documents bearing the bright red seal of the county court. This specific folder was the ultimate culmination of months of quiet, highly classified, ruthless corporate strategy. It was a strategy I had initiated long before the Forbes article was even a concept. While my family was busy treating me like a complete failure and worshipping Trent, the highly aggressive acquisitions department of my fintech firm had been quietly analyzing the local private equity markets. We were constantly looking for distressed commercial assets and toxic debt portfolios to purchase at a steep discount to diversify our holdings. During that routine, highly confidential financial analysis, my legal team uncovered a massive, horrifying truth about Trent's boutique investment fund. Trent was not a financial genius. Trent was a desperate drowning fraud whose entire portfolio was collapsing. And my father had foolishly tied the entire family's survival to Trent's rapidly sinking ship. My company had quietly stepped in and purchased all of Trent's toxic debt on the secondary market. I did not just have liquid money. I had absolute terrifying legal leverage over every single asset they possessed. I pulled the thick folder out of the safe and placed it carefully inside my designer leather tote bag. My father wanted a serious wealth management discussion. He wanted to sit at the head of his long dining table and dictate exactly how my new resources should benefit the family. He expected me to walk through his grand front doors as the obedient, eager-to-please daughter who would finally be grateful for a legitimate seat at his table. He had absolutely no idea that I was not coming to dinner as his compliant daughter. I was arriving as his sole, uncompromising creditor. I adjusted my suit jacket, picked up my heavy bag, and walked purposefully out of my office. It was time to show them exactly what ruthless, unfeeling business truly looked like. The ride to Buckhead was smooth and quiet in the back of my private town car. I watched the glittering skyline of downtown Atlanta slowly fade into the lush, dark canopy of old money neighborhoods. The massive wrought iron gates of my parents' estate loomed ahead in the darkness. They swung open automatically to reveal the sweeping circular driveway paved with imported gray stone. I stepped out of the car, clutching my heavy leather tote bag tightly against my side. The cool evening air felt sharp and bracing against my skin. The heavy oak front door swung wide open before I even reached the top step of the porch. My mother stood there wearing a pristine cream-colored silk dress and a smile so wide and bright it looked physically painful to maintain. "My brilliant daughter has finally arrived," Brenda announced loudly. She stepped forward and pulled me into an aggressive embrace. Her expensive floral perfume was overwhelming. She patted my back and ushered me into the grand foyer. The contrast between this sickeningly sweet welcome and the cold dismissal she had given me on the phone just 1 week ago was staggering. I kept my expression perfectly neutral. I stepped out of her embrace and walked into the sprawling living room. The space was intentionally designed to intimidate anyone who walked through the doors. Massive crystal chandeliers, hung from vaulted ceilings, and original oil paintings lined the pristine white walls. My father Warren stood by a polished mahogany bar cart pouring drinks. For the first time in 10 long years, he was personally pouring a drink for me. He held out a heavy crystal glass of vintage scotch, with a broad, welcoming smile that did not quite reach his cold eyes. "Look who finally hit the jackpot," Warren said smoothly as I approached. He pressed the cold, sweating glass directly into my hand. "We always knew you had a knack for computers, Sydney. We just had to wait for the rest of the world to catch up." I took the glass but did not take a sip. I looked carefully around the large room. My sister Jasmine was sitting stiffly on a plush velvet sofa. She wore a tight designer dress and a forced smile that barely concealed the raw, bitter envy burning intensely in her eyes. She offered a stiff, quick nod, but blatantly refused to stand up and greet me properly. Then I saw him. Trent stood leaning casually against the marble fireplace. He wore a crisp blue dress shirt and a highly confident smirk. He held a thick manila folder in his right hand, tapping it gently against his leg. He looked exactly like a man who believed he held all the power in the room. "Let us move to the dining room," Warren instructed. "We have important family matters to discuss, and we should do it over a good meal." We relocated to the formal dining room. A private chef had prepared an elaborate spread of roasted meats and delicate side dishes. The heavy silver cutlery gleamed under the warm light. I took my seat near the center of the long table. Warren sat at the head. Brenda sat to his right. Trent and Jasmine sat directly across from me. Nobody made a move to touch the food. The air in the room was thick with calculated anticipation. Warren leaned forward and rested his elbows on the polished table. "Sydney, we are all incredibly proud of the news today," he began. "Seeing our family name attached to a $99 million valuation on Forbes is a monumental achievement. But as a man who has built and protected wealth for decades, I have to be honest with you. Bringing in that kind of corporate capital is dangerous." I kept my eyes locked on his face. I asked him quietly how that could be dangerous. "You are a young black woman operating in a very aggressive space," Warren explained with a patronizing tone. "The venture capital world is full of sharks. They will smile in your face and steal your equity behind your back. You simply do not have the experience to manage this level of corporate finance alone. Wealth preservation requires a specific type of strategic mind." "That is where family comes in," Brenda chimed in quickly. She reached out and touched my hand. "We want to protect you, Sydney. We want to make sure you do not lose everything you just gained. Trent has been working on a brilliant strategy to secure your assets." I slowly pulled my hand away from my mother. I turned my attention to Trent. He pushed himself up from his chair and walked slowly around the large table. He carried the manila folder with a sense of immense self-importance. He stopped right beside my chair. "Sydney, I have been reviewing the public disclosures about your Series B funding round," Trent said. He used the slow, measured voice of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. "You got very lucky with this valuation. But you have to understand that Forbes money is just paper money. It is not real liquidity. The tax liabilities alone will completely bankrupt you if you do not restructure immediately." Trent dropped the heavy manila folder directly onto my dinner plate. The thud echoed loudly in the quiet room. The folder completely covered my untouched food. "I have drafted a comprehensive family trust agreement," Trent continued. He leaned over me, placing both hands on the back of my chair to box me in. We are going to transfer 80% of your equity voting rights into a management fund under my direct control. This will optimize your tax burden and protect the company from hostile takeovers. I stared down at the thick stack of legal documents resting on my plate. I did not move to open them. Do not worry about your day-to-day lifestyle, Trent added with a dismissive chuckle. The trust is designed to pay you a very generous monthly allowance. You will have more than enough cash to go shopping and take vacations and live comfortably. You can step away from the stress of the boardroom and let the men handle the heavy lifting. You did the fun part by designing the app. Now it is time to let the real financial experts secure the capital. The sheer arrogance radiating from him was almost suffocating. He honestly believed I would sign away my entire life's work for an allowance. He believed his white privilege and Wall Street vocabulary would easily overpower my intelligence. My father sat at the head of the table nodding in total agreement with Trent. My mother looked at me with expectant, demanding eyes. Jasmine simply stared at the contract with a hungry, desperate expression. I calmly reached out and picked up the manila folder. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of their profound disrespect. I did not feel angry. I felt an absolute freezing clarity. I slowly turned my head to look up at Trent. He was still smiling that arrogant, entitled smile. I set the folder down on the table beside my plate. I looked Trent dead in the eyes. I asked Trent if he was demanding control of my $99 million to cover up the $12 million he just vaporized from his own fund last Tuesday. The smile vanished from his face instantly. The smug confidence drained out of his posture, leaving behind a stark, hollow panic. His jaw dropped slightly, and his eyes widened in sheer terror. Across the table, Jasmine gasped loudly. Warren gripped the edge of the wood so hard his knuckles turned white. The perfectly constructed facade of their wealthy southern dynasty cracked wide open in a single second. Exactly 7 days after the awards ceremony, the digital landscape shifted completely. I sat behind the expansive walnut desk in my Midtown Atlanta office, watching the wall-mounted monitor. At precisely 9 in the morning, Forbes published their highly anticipated annual global technology issue. The web page refreshed and my face dominated the screen. The photograph captured me wearing a tailored emerald suit with my arms crossed, projecting absolute authority. The bold letters beneath my image declared, "The $99 million Series B FinTech Queen." The impact was instantaneous. Beyond the thick glass walls of my office, the open floor plan erupted into loud cheers. My lead developers and financial analysts were standing at their desks, clapping and celebrating the validation of our grueling work. The corporate communication system began chiming relentlessly. Notifications flooded my secondary monitor. Venture capital firms that had previously ignored my emails were suddenly requesting introductory meetings. Major media outlets sent urgent interview requests. The industry was finally acknowledging the sheer scale of the microlending platform I had built from nothing. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my dark roasted coffee, letting the pure, heavy magnitude of the incredible moment settle deeply into my weary bones. For years, I had operated in the shadows, absorbing the condescension from traditional finance executives who thought a black woman creating an alternative credit scoring algorithm was a cute charity project. Now the market had spoken and assigned a massive, undeniable numeric value to my intellect. I watched my inbox counter tick upward rapidly, but I did not reach for my keyboard. I instructed my executive assistant to hold all calls and forward the media inquiries to the public relations department. I was not interested in speaking to journalists or eager investors this morning. I was waiting for a very specific reaction from a very specific group of people. The minutes ticked by slowly on the digital clock resting on the corner of my desk. 10 excruciatingly slow minutes passed in complete silence. 20 minutes drifted by. I imagined the scene playing out inside the sprawling Buckhead mansion. My parents were likely enjoying their catered breakfast, scrolling through their morning news feeds on their tablets. Jasmine was probably checking her social media metrics. Trent was likely reviewing the financial markets. I knew the exact moment the algorithm would push the top trending business news directly onto their screens. Exactly 30 minutes after the Forbes article went live, my personal cell phone vibrated against the polished wood of my desk. It was not a phone call. It was a brief text message. I looked at the name displayed on the screen. It was Warren. My father had not initiated a conversation with me in over 2 years. The last time he texted me first was to remind me to move my car out of the driveway so Trent could park his new sports car closer to the front door. I picked up the phone and read the message. It read, "Family dinner at 6:30 tonight. We need to have an important wealth management discussion. Your presence is mandatory. Do not be late." I read the words twice to fully absorb the breathtaking arrogance radiating from the screen. There was no mention of the article. There was no expression of paternal pride. He did not offer a single word of congratulations for his daughter achieving something monumental. The very second he saw a $99 million valuation attached to my name, he instantly viewed my hard-earned capital as a communal family asset. He decided that this immense wealth desperately needed to be managed and controlled by the men in the family who knew better. He expected me to drop everything, run back to the family estate, and gratefully hand over the keys to the kingdom I had built with my own blood and sweat. A cold, sharp sense of satisfaction washed over me. I did not type a reply. I placed the phone face down on the desk, ensuring the demanding message was hidden from view. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I walked across the plush carpet towards the far wall of my private office. A large, vibrant, abstract painting hung there perfectly centered. I reached out and pulled the heavy wooden frame to the side, revealing a reinforced steel wall safe embedded deep within the concrete structure of the building. I carefully entered the complex numerical code and turned the heavy metal handle. The thick door swung open with a quiet click. Inside the dark, secure space rested a single meticulously organized legal folder. The thick stack of papers inside bore the bright red official seal of the county court. This folder was the ultimate culmination of months of highly classified corporate strategy that I had initiated long before Forbes ever contacted me. While my family was busy treating me like a complete failure and worshiping my brother-in-law, my acquisitions department had been quietly analyzing local private equity markets. We had been searching for distressed commercial assets and toxic debt portfolios to purchase at a steep discount. During that routine financial analysis, my legal team uncovered a massive, horrifying truth about the boutique investment fund run by Trent. His entire portfolio was collapsing under the weight of severe financial mismanagement, and my father had foolishly tied the survival of our entire family legacy to his rapidly sinking ship. My company had decisively stepped in and purchased all of his toxic debt on the secondary market through an anonymous shell corporation. The transaction was completely untraceable back to my name. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that the very same woman they had consistently ridiculed was now holding the strings to their entire financial future. I reached into the safe and pulled out the thick folder. I placed it carefully inside my structured leather tote bag. My father wanted a serious wealth management discussion. He expected me to walk through his front doors as the obedient, eager daughter, desperate for a seat at his table. He had absolutely no idea that I was not coming to dinner as his compliant daughter. I was arriving as his sole uncompromising creditor. I adjusted my perfectly tailored suit jacket, smoothed the imaginary wrinkles, and allowed a cold, confident smile to finally spread across my face. Time to balance the ledger once and for all. The drive from my midtown office to the Buckhead estate took exactly 42 minutes. I drove my dark gray luxury sedan in complete silence. I did not turn on the radio. I did not review any more financial documents. I simply watched the sprawling cityscape slowly shift into the dense manicured tree lines of Atlanta's most exclusive neighborhoods. The heavy leather tote bag, resting on the passenger seat beside me, contained everything I needed to permanently alter the trajectory of my entire bloodline. For 31 years, I had made this exact same drive, feeling a familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I used to pull up to my parents' house praying that today would be the day they finally offered me a single ounce of genuine respect. Today, that desperate girl was completely dead and gone. I felt nothing but a calm surgical precision. I steered my car through the towering wrought iron gates of my father's property. The massive brick mansion loomed at the end of the long, winding driveway. I parked my car perfectly centering it near the front steps. I picked up my bag and walked toward the heavy double doors. Before I could even raise my hand to knock, the door swung wide open. My mother stood in the grand entryway wearing a highly expensive silk blouse and a smile so wide and unnatural it looked painful. "My brilliant daughter has finally arrived," Brenda announced loudly. Her voice echoed off the marble floors of the foyer. She stepped forward and pulled me into an aggressive, suffocating embrace. Her strong floral perfume filled my lungs. She rubbed my back affectionately and showered me with compliments about how radiant and successful I looked. This was the exact same woman who had hung up on me a week ago while drinking champagne at a country club. I maintained a perfectly neutral expression. I allowed her to hug me without wrapping my arms around her in return. I stepped back and walked past her into the sprawling formal living room. The atmosphere inside the house was nauseatingly warm and overly manufactured. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a bright glowing light over the plush velvet furniture and original artwork. My father Warren stood near a custom mahogany bar cart in the corner of the room. This was a man who had never once offered to pour me a drink in my entire adult life. Yet the moment I walked into his line of sight, he immediately reached for a heavy crystal tumbler. He poured a generous measure of his most expensive vintage scotch. He walked directly toward me with a wide, beaming smile that completely failed to reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Look who finally decided to join the big leagues," Warren said smoothly, as he pressed the cold, sweating glass into my hand. "We always knew you had a knack for those computers, Sydney. We just had to wait for the rest of the world to catch up and see your true value." I took the glass, but I did not take a sip. I looked around the room, taking a silent inventory of the players on the board. My older sister Jasmine was sitting stiffly on the edge of a designer sofa. She wore a tight cocktail dress and a forced smile that barely concealed the raw, toxic envy burning intensely in her eyes. The golden child was clearly struggling to process the reality that her younger sister was suddenly worth nearly $100 million. She offered a stiff, quick nod, but she blatantly refused to stand up and greet me properly. She muttered a quiet congratulations that sounded more like a physical struggle than a genuine sentiment. I simply nodded back at her, allowing the heavy, awkward silence to stretch between us. Then my eyes landed on the architect of their impending destruction. Trent stood casually leaning against the ornate marble fireplace. He wore a crisp, light blue dress shirt with the top two buttons undone, projecting the classic arrogant image of a wealthy white finance bro. He held a thick manila folder in his right hand, gently tapping it against his thigh. He wore a smug, patronizing smirk that told me he honestly believed he was the smartest, most capable person in the room. He looked at me not as a successful technology founder, but as an uneducated lottery winner who desperately needed his superior guidance. Trent raised his glass toward me in a mock salute. He told me that I had managed to pull off quite the impressive parlor trick today. He said the venture capital markets were highly unpredictable, but I had somehow managed to catch a lucky wave at the perfect time. His blatant refusal to acknowledge my skill or the sophisticated algorithm I had built was entirely predictable. He needed to attribute my massive financial success to blind luck to protect his own fragile ego. I simply stared at him without blinking until his smug smile faltered ever so slightly. Warren clapped his hands together loudly, breaking the tense silence. He announced that the private chef had finished preparing an elaborate dinner, and it was time for us to move to the formal dining room. We all walked down the wide hallway and took our respective seats at the massive polished dining table. Warren took his customary position at the head of the table. Brenda sat to his right. Trent and Jasmine sat directly across from me. The table was covered in expensive silver platters of roasted meats and delicate side dishes. Nobody made a single move to touch the food. The air in the room was thick with a calculated, heavy anticipation. Warren leaned forward and rested his forearms on the gleaming table. He looked at me with an expression of deep, manufactured concern. "Sydney, we are all incredibly proud of the news today," he began, his voice taking on a serious paternal tone. "Seeing our family name attached to a $99 million valuation on Forbes is a monumental achievement. But as a man who has built and protected wealth for decades, I have to be completely honest with you. Bringing in that kind of massive corporate capital is incredibly dangerous. I kept my eyes locked on his face, maintaining my absolute silence. I waited for the inevitable pivot. I knew exactly where this conversation was heading. "You are a young black woman operating in a very aggressive space," Warren explained, shaking his head slowly. "The venture capital world is full of ruthless sharks. They will smile in your face and steal your equity behind your back. You simply do not have the practical experience to manage this level of corporate finance alone. Wealth preservation requires a specific type of strategic mind. That is exactly where family comes in." Brenda chimed in quickly, reaching out to touch my arm. "We want to protect you, Sydney. We want to make sure you do not lose everything you just gained to some greedy corporate lawyers." Warren picked up his crystal glass of scotch. He held it up in the air, looking directly at me with a triumphant, greedy gleam in his eyes. He clinked his glass against the table. "To our little girl who finally hit the jackpot," Warren said loudly. "Now let us talk about protecting that money." Warren took his seat at the head of the long dining table, placing his empty crystal glass next to his perfectly arranged silverware. The private chef had laid out a massive spread of roasted duck and garlic asparagus, but nobody made a single move to pick up a fork or serve themselves. The heavy scent of the rich food hung in the warm air, creating a sickening contrast to the freezing tension radiating from my family members. I sat perfectly still with my hands folded neatly in my lap, simply watching the men prepare to execute their highly coordinated attack. I knew exactly how my father operated. He always started with a false sense of extreme urgency, designed to make his targets feel completely destabilized and vulnerable. Warren leaned forward, resting his forearms heavily on the polished mahogany table. He locked his cold eyes onto my face and adopted a deeply patronizing tone that he usually reserved for incompetent employees. He told me that securing a $99 million valuation was certainly a flashy media headline, but the reality of managing that level of corporate wealth was far too complex for someone with my limited background. He said the financial world was a brutal landscape designed to crush naive founders who did not understand how to protect their assets. He spoke slowly and deliberately, making sure every single word carried the heavy weight of his absolute authority. He then shifted his tactic to something far more insidious. Warren lowered his voice and told me that being a young black woman in the technology sector placed a massive target directly on my back. He said the white billionaire venture capitalists sitting in their glass towers would smile in my face while their lawyers quietly stripped me of every single asset I had built. I insisted that my sudden wealth made me incredibly vulnerable to predators who would gladly exploit my lack of institutional knowledge. He used my race and my gender as weapons to convince me that I was entirely incapable of surviving in the rooms where I had already proven myself to be the smartest person present. My mother, Brenda, immediately leaned across the table to reinforce his manipulative narrative. She reached her hand out as if she wanted to comfort me, but her eyes were entirely devoid of any actual maternal warmth. She told me that family was the only true protection I had against a world that wanted to tear me down. She said they had spent the entire afternoon worrying about my safety and my future after seeing the Forbes article. Brenda insisted that my father was only trying to shield me from the devastating tax liabilities and hostile corporate takeovers that would inevitably destroy my life if I tried to handle this massive fortune all by myself. I briefly shifted my gaze to my sister Jasmine. She was sitting rigidly in her velvet dining chair, staring a hole right through my head. The raw jealousy radiating from her was almost palpable, but she nodded along with our parents because she knew this strategic ambush directly benefited her own household. If they managed to seize control of my company, her husband Trent would suddenly have access to an enormous pool of legitimate capital. Jasmine was perfectly willing to sit in complete silence and watch our parents emotionally break her younger sister, if it meant she could continue funding her lavish country club lifestyle without having to lift a single finger. Warren clapped his hands together, once drawing the attention of the room back to his end of the table. He announced that he had already consulted with his top-tier legal team, and they had developed the perfect solution to protect my vulnerable assets. He told me they were going to establish a comprehensive family trust specifically designed to shelter the fintech platform from aggressive taxation and corporate raiders. It sounded like a reasonable business strategy until he revealed the specific mechanics of the arrangement. Warren demanded that I transfer exactly 80% of my equity voting rights directly into this newly formed trust. He said it was the only way to ensure the wealth remained securely within the family bloodline. He did not stop there. Warren then declared that this family trust required a seasoned financial expert to serve as the sole managing director. He gestured grandly toward Trent, who was still standing near the fireplace looking incredibly pleased with himself. My father praised Trent as a financial prodigy who understood the complex nuances of wealth management and aggressive tax optimization. Warren said Trent had graciously agreed to take on the massive burden of managing my $99 million company, so I would not have to worry about the stressful day-to-day operations of corporate finance. They were literally planning to hand the keys to my entire empire over to a failing private equity manager under the guise of paternal protection. I sat there quietly listening to the sheer, unadulterated audacity of their coordinated family plan. They genuinely believed I was foolish enough to sign away 80% of my sweat equity and surrender my voting power just because my father used a stern voice and my mother pretended to care about my safety. They thought they could casually strip me of my power and reduce me to a silent, passive shareholder in the very company I had built from the ground up. I did not interrupt Warren as he continued to outline the supposed benefits of this blatant robbery. I wanted to hear every single detail of their delusional trap before I systematically burned it to the ground. Trent finally pushed himself away from the marble fireplace and walked slowly toward the dining table. He carried the thick manila folder with a sense of immense theatrical importance. He walked around the long table until he was standing directly behind my chair. I could smell his expensive cologne and feel the arrogant heat radiating from his body as he loomed over me. He did not ask for my permission to approach my personal space. He operated with the blind, unearned confidence of a man who was entirely used to getting exactly what he wanted without ever having to work hard for it. Trent stepped forward and reached his arm over my shoulder. He held the heavy manila folder over my untouched plate of food. He did not gently place the documents on the table. He deliberately dropped the thick folder directly onto my dinner plate, letting it completely cover my meal. The loud, arrogant thud of the paper hitting the fine porcelain echoed clearly through the dead silent dining room. The message was unmistakable. My sustenance, my comfort, and my presence at this table were entirely irrelevant compared to the contract he expected me to sign. Trent slid the folder slightly forward, ensuring it sat exactly in my line of sight, sealing the trap they had so carefully laid out for me. Trent left the heavy manila folder resting squarely on top of my dinner plate, completely covering the meal I had not touched. He placed both of his hands firmly on the high back of my dining chair, deliberately trapping me between his rigid arms and the heavy mahogany table. He leaned down so closely that I could feel the arrogant heat radiating from his body and smell the sharp citrus notes of his overly expensive cologne. He spoke with the slow, exaggerated patience of a seasoned adult, trying to explain a highly complex mathematical equation to a particularly slow and confused toddler. He told me that I needed to listen very carefully to his advice, because the real world of aggressive corporate finance was vastly different from the colorful, friendly startup culture I was used to playing around in. He said building a little application on my laptop in my spare time was a cute achievement, but managing a corporate treasury was an entirely different beast. I explained that a $99 million valuation printed on the digital cover of a magazine was completely meaningless when you stepped into the actual financial district. He called it fake paper money generated by overzealous tech bloggers who did not understand fundamental economics or sustainable revenue models. He said that, until that raw equity was properly liquidated, structured, and sheltered by seasoned professionals, it was nothing more than a dangerous liability, floating in the wind, waiting to be taxed into oblivion. Trent told me that I completely lacked the established Wall Street pedigree required to navigate the brutal coming storms of the corporate sector. He said I had no institutional banking relationships, no historical backing in the traditional financial sector, and absolutely no clue how to manage institutional shareholders. He insisted that the wealthy white venture capitalists who had heavily funded my platform were simply using my company as a convenient diversity token to improve their public relations image, and they would inevitably bleed my company dry the very moment my profit margins dipped. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, looking at the textured cream wallpaper across the room, while his incredibly condescending voice washed over me. Trent shifted his weight behind me and tapped his polished leather shoe against the hardwood floor, emphasizing his perceived authority. He instructed me to open the folder right now and sign the final page of the legal transfer agreement. He promised that his boutique private equity firm would immediately absorb my shares and ruthlessly restructure the corporate governance to protect the capital from outside interference. He laid out his incredibly insulting and demeaning vision for my financial future. He told me that the newly established family trust would guarantee me a highly generous monthly allowance. He said I would receive a massive direct deposit on the first of every single month, ensuring I would never have to worry about paying my personal bills or managing complex payroll accounts ever again. He leaned even closer and lowered his voice into a conspiratorial whisper, treating me like a naive child who needed to be saved from her own ambition. He suggested that I could finally relax, let go of the stressful startup grind, and truly enjoy the fruits of my extremely lucky break. He said I could take endless luxury vacations to the Hamptons, buy as many designer handbags as my heart desired, and spend my days completely free of heavy corporate stress. He told me it was time to step away from the harsh, demanding environment of the executive boardroom and let the real men handle the heavy lifting of wealth preservation. He explicitly stated that managing a nine-figure asset portfolio required an aggressive masculine temperament and a ruthless business instinct that I simply did not possess. He fully expected me to quietly trade my entire life work for a glorified shopping allowance just so he could play the role of the ultimate financial savior for my aging parents. I allowed my calm gaze to drift slowly across the long dining table to observe the rest of my family. My father Warren sat completely relaxed in his oversized leather armchair, nodding in profound enthusiastic agreement with every single insulting word Trent uttered. Warren honestly believed that placing my massive independent wealth under the total control of a mediocre white man was the absolute smartest business decision imaginable. My mother, Brenda, held her crystal wine glass delicately and offered me a tight, encouraging smile, signaling that I should simply be overwhelmingly grateful for Trent stepping in to rescue me from my own perceived incompetence. My sister Jasmine was practically vibrating with vicious, unrestrained excitement in her seat. She stared hungrily at the folder resting on my plate, already calculating exactly how my surrendered equity would directly fund her next luxury vehicle and elevate her social status at the Piedmont Country Club. None of them saw me as a highly capable, fiercely intelligent chief executive officer who had just conquered a ruthless industry. They only saw a rebellious, disobedient daughter who needed to be violently forced back into her proper subordinate place within the strict family hierarchy. They truly thought they had successfully cornered me in my childhood home, using my own flesh and blood to apply maximum emotional pressure. I slowly raised my hands and rested them gently on the polished surface of the table. I deliberately reached forward and picked up the thick manila folder. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath in deep anticipation. I could feel Trent tense up behind my chair, excitedly anticipating his imminent financial victory. I opened the heavy paper cover and pretended to examine the first page of the binding legal contract. I traced my index finger down the wide margins, casually scanning the densely packed legal jargon that was designed to completely strip away all of my executive voting rights and hand absolute unchecked authority directly to his failing private equity firm. I took my time reading, letting the dead silence stretch out and significantly amplify the intense anticipation burning through the dining room. I closed the folder with a soft, definitive snap. I smoothly pushed my heavy chair back, forcing Trent to take a quick, awkward step away from me to avoid getting hit by the solid wood. I stood up slowly and deliberately, taking complete command of the physical space in the room. I turned around to face him directly. He stood there with his chest puffed out, wearing a supremely confident smirk, completely assured that I was about to ask for a pen to sign away my entire tech empire. I looked him dead in the eyes, piercing right through his pathetic, fragile facade of Wall Street superiority. I kept my voice incredibly soft and dangerously calm, ensuring that every single syllable landed with maximum devastating impact in the quiet room. I asked Trent if he was standing in my parents' dining room, demanding absolute control over my $99 million, just so he could secretly cover up the $12 million he had completely vaporized from his own failing investment fund last Tuesday. The thick silence following my question to Trent shattered instantly into a million jagged pieces. Jasmine slammed both of her perfectly manicured hands onto the heavy wooden dining table. The silverware rattled violently against the fine porcelain plates. She pushed her chair back with such tremendous force that it nearly tipped over backward onto the floor. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face. She began screaming at the top of her lungs, defending the fragile honor of her mediocre husband. She demanded to know how I dared to speak to Trent with such blatant disrespect in our parents' home. She called me an arrogant, ungrateful brat who had completely lost her mind just because my name was printed in a popular business magazine. Jasmine leaned aggressively across the table, her voice echoing harshly off the high vaulted ceilings of the formal dining room. She told me I was completely delusional if I thought I was suddenly on the same level as her husband. She shrieked that Trent handled actual institutional wealth while I was just playing silly games on a laptop. Then she reached back into our shared history and pulled out the very memory she thought would hurt me the most. She yelled that I was just acting bitter because of what happened 4 years ago. She proudly reminded the entire room about the cold, rainy night I came crying to our father, begging for a pathetic $5,000 loan to buy server space for my stupid little application. She laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that cut through the heavy, tense air. Jasmine reminded me how our father had rightfully thrown me out of his home office that night. She shouted that I was a complete embarrassment back then, and I was still a huge embarrassment right now. She told me that I only got lucky because some naive venture capitalist decided to throw pity money at a diversity project to make themselves look progressive. She insisted that Trent actually worked for his millions, while I just stumbled blindly into a lucky break. She ordered me to stop projecting my deeply rooted insecurities onto a man who was actually trying to save me from my own inevitable financial ruin and protect my future. She stood there with her chest heaving, utterly convinced she had put me back in my subordinate place, just like she always did when we were younger. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch or break eye contact with my furious older sister. I remained standing tall and perfectly composed. I looked at Jasmine with a mixture of profound pity and absolute clinical detachment. I let her angry, echoing shouts fade completely into the walls before I finally opened my mouth to speak. I kept my tone perfectly level, forcing everyone in the room to lean in slightly to hear my measured response. I thanked Jasmine for bringing up that specific painful night from 4 years ago. I told her it was the absolute perfect example to illustrate the sheer staggering hypocrisy taking place at this dinner table tonight in front of everyone. I turned my calm gaze from Jasmine to my father Warren, and then slowly back to Trent. I laid out the raw, undeniable mathematics of their current aggressive demand. I told them that 4 years ago I asked my own flesh and blood for exactly $5,000 to help build the basic foundation of my technology company. I offered fair equity, I offered structured repayment plans, and I offered my absolute unwavering dedication. They looked at me and decided I was not worth a single penny of their vast generational wealth. They let me walk out into the cold night with absolutely nothing but my own sheer willpower to keep me going forward. Now I had turned that empty nothing into a platform valued at exactly $99 million. I stepped slightly closer to the table, resting my fingertips lightly on the polished mahogany edge. I asked Jasmine how she could stand there and demand that I hand over nearly $80 million in sweat equity to a family that would not even spare $5,000 to feed my starving ambition. I told her the math simply did not add up. I explained that they were treating me like a helpless charity case, while simultaneously trying to siphon my hard-earned capital to fund their lavish country club lifestyles. I looked Trent up and down and stated clearly that I would never surrender the empire I built with my own bleeding hands to a man who could not even keep his own investment portfolio above water. Trent looked absolutely furious and deeply embarrassed. His face turned a severely splotchy pale shade of bright pink. He opened his mouth to shout something back at me, but the words completely failed him. The devastating truth of my financial logic had backed him entirely into a corner. Jasmine sank back into her velvet dining chair, looking momentarily stunned by my absolute refusal to back down and submit. The entire power dynamic of the grand dining room had fundamentally shifted in my favor without me having to raise my voice once. I had effortlessly dismantled their aggressive corporate ambush, using their own toxic history against them. I was completely prepared to pick up my heavy leather tote bag and walk right out the front door, leaving them all choking on the bitter dust of their own immense failures. Before I could take a single step toward the grand foyer, my mother intervened. Brenda did not raise her voice like Jasmine had. She did not use aggressive corporate jargon like Trent. She knew exactly how to pivot the battlefield when raw intimidation completely failed to break my spirit. Brenda slowly pushed her chair back and stood up from her seat at the head of the table. She walked around the dining table with the smooth, elegant grace of a seasoned Southern socialite. She did not approach me to defend my honor or apologize for the horrific way her husband and daughter had just spoken to me. She was preparing to launch a masterclass in deep psychological manipulation. She reached out with both of her hands, stepping directly into my path to deliver the most calculated emotional guilt trip of my entire life. The heavy silence that followed my question hung over the dining table like a thick, suffocating blanket. Trent stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, unable to formulate a single coherent sentence to defend himself. Jasmine remained frozen in her chair, her mouth slightly open as her brain desperately tried to process the reality that her wealthy husband was bleeding millions of dollars. The dynamic had shifted so violently that no one in the room knew how to regain control. That is when my mother decided to intervene. Brenda did not shout or slam her fists on the mahogany table. She was far too calculated for emotional outbursts. She slowly pushed her dining chair back, causing the wooden legs to scrape softly against the rug. She stood up, smoothing the front of her silk dress with deliberate grace. She walked around the long dining table, stepping directly between Trent and me. She reached out with both hands and gently grasped my shoulders, attempting to project an image of deep maternal warmth. Her sudden physical proximity forced me to look directly into her eyes, which were brimming with manufactured tears. "Sydney, my sweet, beautiful girl." Brenda began, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. "You have to understand that your father and I are under an immense amount of pressure right now. We did not want to burden you with family problems while you were busy playing with your computers. But things have been incredibly difficult lately. Warren has been experiencing a minor cash flow hiccup with his logistics company. The shipping industry is experiencing a seasonal downturn, and supply chain delays have temporarily locked up a portion of our liquid assets. We are asset-rich, but cash-poor right now." She gently squeezed my shoulders, leaning in closer, so her strong floral perfume enveloped me. "Trent has been an absolute godsend to this family during this transition period." Brenda continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He has been quietly keeping your father's business afloat, using his private equity fund to bridge our temporary financial gaps. He stepped up and acted like a true son to us when we needed him the most. He sacrificed his own resources to ensure this family did not lose our social standing or our home. Now that you have stumbled into this massive influx of corporate capital, it is your fundamental duty to step up and do the exact same thing." I looked at her face, watching the sheer manipulation unfold in real time. She was completely glossing over the fact that Trent had just lost $12 million. She was framing him as a selfless savior who deserved my company as a reward for temporarily loaning my father money. "You are blood, Sydney," Brenda said, her tone becoming sharper and more demanding beneath the sweet Southern facade. "You owe your entire existence and your newfound success to the sacrifices your father and I made for you. Do you honestly think you could have built a multi-million-dollar financial platform if you had been born to any other family? You inherited your father's elite business genes. You have his sharp analytical mind and his relentless drive flows. You did not build this empire all by yourself in a vacuum. You built it using the intellectual foundation we provided." She removed her hands from my shoulders and crossed her arms over her chest, looking down at me with an expression of strict parental authority. "Therefore, the wealth you generated using our genetic gifts, Rightfully belongs to the collective family trust, Brenda declared smoothly. You need to sign that contract right now and inject your capital into Trent's management fund to save your father's legacy. It is the only moral and acceptable thing to do. You cannot simply take your lucky earnings and walk away while the very people who gave you life are asking for help. Family loyalty means sharing. I did not break eye contact with my mother. I did not blink or show a single ounce of the profound disgust churning in my stomach. I simply reached forward and pushed my untouched plate of food away from me. I looked up at Brenda and spoke with a calm, flat, steady voice. I owe you absolutely nothing, I said clearly. I did not inherit elite business genes. I inherited a lifetime of rejection, and I used that pain to build an algorithm that your husband could not even begin to comprehend. I am not signing away a single penny of my equity to cover your logistical failures or his fraudulent investment losses. The polite maternal mask immediately melted off my mother's face, leaving behind a cold, bitter fury. She opened her mouth to launch another vicious reprimand, but Trent suddenly shoved his way past her. His previous facade of a friendly, charming wealth manager was completely gone. He was no longer pretending to be my savior. He was a desperate, trapped man whose luxurious lifestyle was actively burning to the ground. Trent slammed his open palms down hard on the dining table, leaning aggressively into my personal space. His face was twisted into an ugly, violent sneer. He abandoned the financial jargon and resorted to outright extortion. "You listen to me, you arrogant little bitch!" Trent hissed, his voice dripping with pure venom. "You think just because some magazine put your face on their website that you actually hold any real power in this city. You are nothing but a temporary trend. I play golf with the board members of every commercial bank in the Southeast. I sit on the steering committees that decide which tech companies get local municipal contracts." He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my face. "If you do not pick up a single pen and sign that management transfer agreement, right this second, I will personally make sure you never see another dime of institutional funding. I will use every connection I have at the Piedmont Country Club to completely blacklist your platform. I will call my partners at the major investment firms and tell them your software is highly unstable and riddled with security flaws. I will destroy your professional reputation before the sun comes up tomorrow. You will be bankrupt and begging us for a place to sleep. Sign the paper right now or I will absolutely bury you forever." I pushed my chair back from the table. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the floor. I stood up and smoothed the front of my emerald green suit. I did not look at my mother or my sister. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Trent as I reached into the pocket of my jacket. I pulled out a sleek silver USB drive. It was a simple piece of metal, but it held the power to obliterate the arrogant facade he had built over the past decade. I turned away from the dining area and walked slowly toward the sunken living room. My heels clicked with a steady rhythmic precision against the hardwood floors. The family followed me with their wide eyes. The heavy silence in the house was absolute. Nobody dared to speak or interrupt my deliberate movement. I walked directly to the smart television mounted above the marble fireplace. I reached behind the black frame and inserted the drive into the side port. I picked up the remote control resting on the mantel and switched the input source. The giant screen blinked once before flooding the dimly lit room with a bright white light. I turned around to face my family. They were all still seated at the table, twisting around in their chairs to look at the screen. I stood beside the fireplace, projecting the exact same ruthless corporate authority I used in boardrooms across the country. I told Trent his fatal flaw was believing that wealth was built by shaking hands on a golf course. I explained true modern power was not driven by country club connections or expensive dress shirts. I said true power was driven by raw data and the algorithmic capacity to see every single hidden vulnerability in a market. I looked at my father and told him that while he was busy teaching my sister how to marry into the right social circles, I was learning how to dismantle corporate infrastructures piece by piece. I explained that the venture capital Trent thought he understood was actually a slow-dying dinosaur. I said my financial technology platform was designed to process millions of transactions per minute, but it also possessed a highly sophisticated secondary function. I told them my acquisitions department utilized automated web scraping and deep data analytics to constantly monitor local private equity firms for signs of terminal distress. Trent shifted uncomfortably in his plush velvet chair. The smug color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very old. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words simply died in his throat. I told him he should save his breath, because there was absolutely nothing he could say to manipulate his way out of raw, undeniable mathematics. I explained that his entire business model relied on projecting an image of untouchable success while quietly bleeding out his investors behind closed doors. I told the room that Trent was a masterful illusionist who had successfully conned my father into believing he was a financial genius. I pressed a button on the remote control. A highly classified financial document appeared on the 80-inch screen. It was covered in complex spreadsheets, red text, and official legal watermarks. Jasmine gasped softly from the dining table, recognizing the distinct logo of her husband's firm at the very top of the page. I told my family that they were currently looking at documents that were legally obtained during a routine risk assessment by my corporate acquisitions team. I explained that when my company analyzed the local markets for potential expansion, we found a massive glaring anomaly in the financial sector. I pointed to a specific column of numbers on the large digital screen. I broke down the complex financial jargon into simple, undeniable truths, so my mother and sister could fully comprehend the massive scale of the deception. I told them that a healthy private equity fund generates consistent returns through diverse, careful investments. I said Trent did not do that. I explained that his firm operated more like a desperate scheme, constantly shuffling new investor capital to pay off older massive debts just to keep the lights on for one more month. I told my father that the man he trusted to secure the family legacy was essentially running a sophisticated gambling ring masked by a polished Wall Street vocabulary. Warren stared at the glowing television screen with his mouth slightly open. His eyes darted frantically across the complex spreadsheets, trying desperately to find a single calculation that would prove my words wrong. Brenda clutched her cloth napkin against her chest, breathing rapidly, as the illusion of her perfect, wealthy son-in-law began to violently unravel before her eyes. I told them that the data never lies, and the data clearly showed a man who was drowning in his own catastrophic failures. I explained that Trent had been using his relationship with our family to project a false sense of stability to his remaining anxious investors. I took a slow step away from the fireplace, walking back toward the edge of the dining room. I looked directly at Jasmine, who was gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table. I told her that the luxurious lifestyle she loved flaunting on social media was entirely funded by stolen time and stolen money. I explained that her husband was not a financial prodigy, but a desperate con artist who was currently running out of places to hide. I said my company had flagged his firm as a high-risk entity months ago, long before any magazine ever decided to put my face on their cover. I raised the remote control again and rested my thumb over the directional pad. I told Trent his threat to blacklist me from the local banks was the funniest thing I had heard all year. I explained I did not need permission from his country club friends to operate in this city because my platform was already rendering their outdated banking methods obsolete. I said his empty threats were the last gasps of a man who realized his entire kingdom was built on quicksand. I told him it was time to show the family exactly where all the missing money had actually gone. I pressed the button and clicked to the first slide, revealing the leaked internal audit of his private equity firm. I pointed to the top left corner of the digital display, where the official seal of an independent auditing firm sat next to the name of Trent's private equity company. I told my family to look closely at the highlighted rows of red numbers cascading down the spreadsheet. I explained that a legitimate wealth management fund operates with complete transparency and maintains strict liquidity ratios to carefully protect the capital of its private investors. I said Trent did not operate a legitimate wealth management fund in any sense. I told them he operated a rapidly sinking ship built entirely on gross negligence and severe criminal arrogance. I explained that the $12 million missing from his primary operating accounts was not lost due to unforeseen market volatility or a sudden economic downturn, as he had likely claimed. I stated clearly that the money was actively and deliberately siphoned out of the corporate accounts through a highly illegal series of sophisticated shell companies registered in offshore tax havens. I watched Trent as his chest began to heave with rapid, shallow breaths. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to grab the sharp edge of the mahogany dining table just to keep himself standing upright. He opened his mouth to deny the heavy accusations, but no sound came out. The sheer weight of the projected evidence had completely paralyzed his vocal cords. I told my mother and father that the man they had blindly trusted to secure their prestigious financial legacy had actually been treating his anxious investors' capital like his own personal unregulated piggy bank for the past 3 years. I pressed the button on the remote control and transitioned the display to the next detailed slide. The screen instantly filled with high-resolution photographs and scanned copies of official property deeds. I looked directly at Jasmine, who was gripping her expensive cloth napkin so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. I told my older sister that her husband had not been working late at the downtown office during those long holiday weekends. He claimed to be traveling for urgent client meetings. I explained that he was actually spending the embezzled $12 million on an incredibly extravagant alternate life down in southern Florida. I pointed to the first official document on the screen, showing the recent cash purchase of a massive luxury yacht registered securely under one of his untraceable shell corporations. I then pointed to the second legal document, which was a certified deed to a sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse located in the absolute most expensive district of Miami. I told Jasmine that Trent did not buy that breathtaking penthouse as a surprise vacation home for their growing family. I explained that the lavish property was currently occupied by a 24-year-old fitness model who had been living there fully expenses paid for the past 8 months. I watched the vibrant color completely drain from Jasmine's face as the devastating reality of her husband's profound betrayal washed violently over her. She turned her head slowly to look at Trent. Her eyes were wide with a horrifying mixture of profound shock and a rapidly rising aggressive fury. Trent completely refused to look back at her. He kept his terrified eyes glued firmly to the hardwood floor, swallowing hard as his perfectly curated personal life was violently dismantled in front of his wife and his wealthy in-laws. I told Jasmine that the heavy diamond tennis bracelet Trent gave her for their anniversary last month was paid for with stolen money that he desperately needed to cover his failing margin calls. I clicked the remote control one more time to reveal the absolute most devastating document of the entire evening. The large television screen illuminated with a highly confidential federal memorandum bearing an undeniable government seal. I told the quiet room that marital infidelity and gross financial mismanagement were certainly destructive personal choices, but they were not the primary reasons my corporate acquisitions team had initially flagged his failing firm. I explained that the federal government had already noticed the massive glaring discrepancies hidden deep within his quarterly reporting schedules. I told Trent that the Securities and Exchange Commission had officially initiated a silent, active probe into his private equity firm exactly 4 days ago. I said the federal agents were currently building a massive airtight criminal case against him for wire fraud and severe fiduciary negligence. I explained that they were quietly subpoenaing his banking records and thoroughly interviewing his former business partners while he was sitting at an exclusive country club, drinking expensive champagne, and pretending to be an untouchable financial titan. I told him that the invisible walls of a federal prison were rapidly closing in around him, and he had absolutely no viable avenue of escape left on the table. I watched the profound, absolute terror finally break through his arrogant, polished facade. He was a broken man who suddenly realized that his stolen money and his country club connections could not possibly save him from a swift and brutal federal indictment. The immense crushing gravity of the situation crashed down heavily upon the entire dining room. Jasmine let out a sudden sharp gasp and covered her trembling mouth with both of her shaking hands. She slumped back heavily into her velvet chair, staring at the bright screen as if it were a physical monster ready to devour her entire existence. Brenda grabbed the edge of her porcelain plate, knocking over her full crystal water glass in the process. The cold water spilled quickly across the expensive table linen, dripping silently onto the floor. The total absolute destruction of their golden son-in-law was unfolding with a ruthless, undeniable clarity. They were all being forced to witness the brutal corporate execution of the man they had willingly placed on a high pedestal far above their own blood daughter. The heavy, oppressive silence in the room was suddenly and violently shattered by a loud, booming noise. My father Warren slammed both of his heavy fists down hard onto the dining table and pushed himself aggressively up from his chair. He stood tall at the head of the table with his chest puffed out and his face flushed an angry dark red. He pointed a thick, rigid finger directly at the television screen and then turned his furious, glaring eyes toward me. He loudly declared that every single document currently displayed on that screen was completely fabricated. He yelled aggressively that I had maliciously forged those federal memos and complex bank statements just to intentionally ruin my sister's marriage out of pure spite and bitter jealousy. Warren roared loudly over the rising chaos in the room, blindly and aggressively defending the very man who had just been exposed as a massive federal criminal. He shouted that Trent was a highly reputable and completely trustworthy partner. Jasmine stared blankly at the massive glowing television screen. The images of the luxury yacht and Miami penthouse reflected brightly in her terrified eyes. Her manicured hands began to tremble violently against the polished wood of the dining table. The pristine image of her flawless, affluent lifestyle was actively burning to ash right in front of her. She shook her head slowly, refusing to process the overwhelming visual evidence. Jasmine pushed her velvet chair backward and stood up on shaky legs. She pointed a trembling finger at the television and demanded that I turn the screen off immediately. Her voice started as a desperate whisper, but quickly escalated into a frantic, deafening shriek. She yelled that I was a bitter, jealous liar who had spent the last 5 years plotting to destroy her perfectly happy marriage. Jasmine screamed that the federal documents were fabricated and the offshore bank accounts were sophisticated corporate forgeries. She desperately tried to rationalize the overwhelming evidence, claiming Trent frequently purchased commercial real estate in southern Florida for legitimate business purposes. She turned her panicked face toward her husband, begging him to validate her frantic delusions. She pleaded with Trent to tell the family the fitness model was just a private administrative assistant renting his corporate property. Trent simply stared at his expensive leather shoes, refusing to meet her desperate, pleading eyes. His deafening silence was the ultimate admission of his profound guilt. Jasmine lost whatever remained of her fragile composure. She lunged toward the center of the room, screaming at me to unplug the silver drive. She cried that I was a cruel, vindictive monster who could not stand to see anyone else in the family experience true happiness. She accused me of hiring private investigators to illegally stalk her husband just to humiliate her in front of our parents. She was completely willing to ignore severe federal wire fraud and blatant marital infidelity if it meant she could preserve her superficial social status at the prestigious local country club. The loud, chaotic screaming was abruptly cut short by a sudden, booming, aggressive roar. Warren stepped away from the head of the dining table and marched directly into the center of the room. He did not move to comfort his sobbing, devastated daughter. He did not pull Jasmine tightly into a protective embrace or demand that Trent leave his own house for betraying his child. Warren was a man driven entirely by pure ego and the preservation of his own perceived intellectual superiority. He positioned himself squarely between me and Trent, instinctively shielding the terrified white-collar criminal from my relentless, brutal corporate assault. Warren glared at me with absolute seething contempt. He loudly declared that the Securities and Exchange Commission memorandums on the screen were nothing more than routine regulatory reviews that all major financial institutions face on a regular basis. He aggressively dismissed the offshore shell companies as standard tax optimization strategies employed by every single successful wealth manager on Wall Street. He shouted that I was completely out of my depth and profoundly ignorant of how high-level institutional banking actually operated. He completely refused to ever accept that a black woman who built an alternative lending application could possibly ever outsmart a man who wore tailored suits and spoke the traditional language of private equity. He stepped closer to me, raising his deep voice to dominate the physical space. He demanded that I immediately apologize to Trent for launching such a baseless and defamatory attack on his professional character. Warren aggressively defended Trent's honor, claiming that his son-in-law had been a respected pillar of the Atlanta financial community for over a decade. He yelled that Trent handled extremely sensitive asset portfolios for some of the most powerful, wealthy elite families in the entire state of northern Georgia. Warren was desperately fighting to keep his own deeply flawed judgment from being exposed to the harsh light of reality. In his blind, chaotic, aggressive panic to prove my data wrong, Warren inadvertently exposed his own fatal vulnerability. He puffed out his chest and proudly announced to the entire room that he had personally vetted Trent's entire operation from top to bottom. He stated loudly that Trent was a highly reputable and exceptionally solvent business partner. He roared that he knew for an absolute verified fact that Trent's private equity firm possessed immense secure liquid capital and a flawless balance sheet. Warren proudly declared that he was completely certain of this financial stability because he had personally signed a massive multi-million-dollar bridge loan guarantee for Trent's private equity firm just very last month. The thick, heavy, profound admission hung frozen in the warm air of the sprawling living room. Brenda suddenly stopped comforting Jasmine and looked up at her husband with an expression of profound, utter confusion. She had absolutely no idea that Warren had secretly entangled the massive family logistics empire with Trent's private investment fund. The color drained rapidly from Brenda's face as the severe financial implications of that hidden signature began to slowly dawn on her. Trent finally looked up from the floor. His eyes darted nervously toward Warren, revealing a brand new layer of sickening panic. His separate, distinct layers of deception were violently colliding together in real time. I slowly stopped clicking the heavy plastic remote control. I let my hand drop to my side, allowing the highly classified leaked federal audit to remain perfectly frozen on the screen. The chaotic screaming in the room faded into a dull, distant background noise. I processed the staggering magnitude of my father's blind stupidity. He had willingly walked directly into a corporate slaughterhouse because the butcher spoke with unearned confidence. I shifted my posture. The dynamic of the room altered as I transitioned from viewing him as an intimidating patriarch to seeing an absolute tragic fool who carelessly handed away his kingdom. I turned my undivided attention away from the television and focused completely on Warren. The room went perfectly still. I looked at my father with a chilling mixture of profound pity and absolute unshakable dominance. I kept my voice incredibly soft, forcing him to listen to the final devastating truth. I told him that was the most tragic part of this entire evening. I asked my father if he had even bothered to carefully read the absolute ironclad legal guarantee Trent made him blindly sign. I pressed the directional pad on the heavy plastic remote control. The giant television screen flickered for a fraction of a second before the highly classified federal audit vanished completely from view. It was instantly replaced by a stark black and white legal document bearing the official letterhead of one of the most predatory commercial lending institutions in the entire state of Georgia. I did not raise my voice or show any outward emotion as the glaring reality of their situation illuminated the dark room. I simply pointed to the bottom of the last page where Warren's unmistakable bold signature was stamped directly next to Trent's messy scrawl. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes and told him that his blind, desperate need to secure the approval of a smooth-talking white financial manager had just cost our family absolutely everything we had ever owned. I walked slowly back toward the mahogany dining table, measuring every single step to let the heavy silence suffocate the room. I explained that the document currently displayed on the 80-inch screen was not a standard corporate bridge loan guarantee. I told him that Trent had intentionally bypassed his own firm's internal compliance department to draft an incredibly aggressive cross-collateralization agreement. I broke the complex legal terminology down into the simplest, most brutal terms possible, so my mother and sister could fully comprehend the massive scale of the impending destruction. I said that Trent did not just use the logistics company as collateral to secure his $15 million toxic debt. I raised my hand and pointed to the specific highlighted paragraph in the middle of the glowing screen. I explained that Trent had strategically bundled the commercial trucking assets together with the actual physical deed to the sprawling Buckhead mansion we were currently standing inside. Warren stared at the screen as the warm color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and suddenly very frail. He took a stumbling, heavy step backward, his hand reaching blindly behind him to grip the high back of his dining chair just to steady his shaking legs. He whispered that Trent had sworn to him it was just a temporary corporate formality designed to satisfy some anxious underwriters. I told my father that his golden son-in-law had deliberately weaponized his blind trust to secure a massive personal bailout while secretly bleeding out his own investors. I explained that Trent knew perfectly well his private equity fund was actively hemorrhaging millions of dollars into untraceable offshore accounts and luxury Miami real estate. I said Trent needed a massive influx of clean, legitimate capital to keep the federal investigators off his back for just a few more months, and he found the absolute perfect willing victim in a father-in-law who cared far more about country club status than reading the fine print of a binding legal contract. The devastating reality of the situation crashed violently into my mother. Brenda let out a sharp, horrifying gasp that sounded like she was physically suffocating on the heavy air in the room. She dropped her expensive wineglass, completely causing it to shatter into dozens of jagged pieces against the pristine hardwood floor. The dark red liquid pooled around her expensive shoes, but she did not even blink. She staggered backward, clutching her chest with both of her shaking hands as her breathing rapidly escalated into a severe panic-induced hyperventilation. She collapsed heavily into her velvet dining chair, staring at the television screen with wide, unblinking, terrified eyes. She finally realized that the perfectly curated, wealthy Southern lifestyle she had spent her entire adult life fiercely protecting was officially gone forever. I looked down at Brenda and told her that all the elegant country club dinners and the expensive silk dresses were currently collateralized to pay for Trent's 24-year-old fitness model in Southern Florida. I said the generational wealth my grandfather had painstakingly scraped together during the civil rights movement had just been casually handed over to a mediocre white con artist who could not even manage a basic investment portfolio without resorting to massive federal wire fraud. I told her that the house she loved showing off to her socialite friends was now nothing more than a highly distressed asset sitting on a commercial bank's ledger, waiting to be ruthlessly liquidated to cover her son-in-law's profound criminal negligence. Jasmine was completely silent. She looked back and forth frantically between her devastated, hyperventilating parents and her terrified husband. The golden child was finally processing the horrifying fact that the man she married had not only humiliated her personally, but had systematically dismantled her parents' entire financial empire just to save his own skin. She realized that her guaranteed inheritance, her luxurious safety net, and her flawless public image were completely tied to a $15 million black hole that could never ever be filled. The fairy tale life she had continuously flaunted in my face to make me feel small was entirely built on a mountain of highly toxic debt that her own father was now legally obligated to pay back in full. I turned my undivided attention back to Trent. He was backed into the dark corner of the dining room, sweating profusely and shaking with absolute, unadulterated terror. I told him that he was a brilliant manipulator for convincing a seasoned black business owner to voluntarily sign away his entire life work without asking a single verifying question. I said his arrogance was almost impressive until his desperate creditors realized the federal government was actively building a criminal case against him. I explained that the commercial lending institution holding my father's cross, collateralized loan, had instantly panicked when they caught wind of the silent Securities and Exchange Commission investigation into his firm. I told the room that banking executives do not wait around for federal indictments to drop before they aggressively liquidate their toxic assets to protect their own bottom line. Trent realized that the invisible walls were completely closing in around him, and his polished professional facade violently shattered into a million pieces. He let out a loud, desperate scream that sounded like a cornered, wounded animal fighting for its life. He shoved his way aggressively past Jasmine, knocking her hard against the sharp edge of the mahogany dining table. He lunged frantically across the living room carpet, sprinting directly toward the massive television screen mounted above the fireplace. He shouted frantically that he could fix the entire situation if everyone just calmed down and stopped overreacting to raw data. He reached out with both of his shaking hands, desperately trying to rip the silver USB drive out of the side port of the television. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he just needed a little bit more time to move some offshore accounts around and pay the angry creditors back before the commercial bank initiated the final foreclosure protocols. I pressed the directional pad on the heavy remote control. The giant television screen flickered before the highly classified federal audit vanished completely from view. It was instantly replaced by a stark black and white legal document bearing the letterhead of a predatory commercial lending institution in Georgia. I did not raise my voice as the glaring reality illuminated the dark room. I simply pointed to the bottom of the last page, where Warren's unmistakable bold signature was stamped next to Trent's messy scrawl. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes and told him his blind, desperate need to secure the approval of a smooth-talking white financial manager had cost our family absolutely everything we had ever owned. I walked slowly back toward the mahogany dining table, measuring every step to let the heavy silence suffocate the room. I explained that the document displayed on the 80-inch screen was not a standard corporate bridge loan guarantee. I told him Trent intentionally bypassed his firm's internal compliance department to draft an incredibly aggressive cross-collateralization agreement. I broke the complex legal terminology down into brutal terms, so my mother and sister could comprehend the massive scale of impending destruction. I said Trent did not just use the logistics company as collateral to secure his $15 million toxic debt. I raised my hand and pointed to the specific highlighted paragraph. I explained Trent strategically bundled the commercial trucking assets together with the actual physical deed to the sprawling Buckhead mansion we were currently standing inside. Warren stared at the screen as the warm color drained from his face, leaving him pale and frail. He took a stumbling step backward, his hand reaching blindly to grip the high back of his dining chair to steady his shaking legs. He whispered that Trent had sworn to him it was a temporary corporate formality designed to satisfy anxious underwriters. I told my father his golden son-in-law deliberately weaponized his blind trust to secure a massive personal bailout while secretly bleeding out his investors. I explained Trent knew perfectly well his private equity fund was hemorrhaging millions of dollars into untraceable offshore accounts and luxury Miami real estate. I said Trent needed a massive influx of clean capital to keep federal investigators off his back for a few months, and he found the perfect willing victim in a father-in-law who cared more about country club status than reading the fine print of a legal contract. The devastating reality of the situation crashed violently into my mother. Brenda let out a sharp, horrifying gasp, sounding like she was physically suffocating on the heavy air. She dropped her expensive wine glass, causing it to shatter into dozens of jagged pieces against the pristine hardwood floor. The dark red liquid pooled around her shoes, but she did not even blink. She staggered backward, clutching her chest with both of her shaking hands as her breathing rapidly escalated into severe panic-induced hyperventilation. She collapsed heavily into her velvet dining chair, staring at the television screen with wide, unblinking, terrified eyes. She finally realized the perfectly curated, wealthy Southern lifestyle she spent her entire adult life fiercely protecting was officially gone forever. I looked down at Brenda and told her all the elegant country club dinners and expensive silk dresses were currently collateralized to pay for Trent's fitness model in Southern Florida. I said the generational wealth my grandfather painstakingly scraped together during the civil rights movement had been casually handed over to a mediocre white con artist who could not manage a basic investment portfolio without resorting to federal wire fraud. I told her the house she loved, showing off to her socialite friends, was now a highly distressed asset sitting on a commercial bank's ledger, waiting to be ruthlessly liquidated to cover her son-in-law's profound criminal negligence. Jasmine was completely silent. She looked frantically between her devastated parents and her terrified husband. The golden child was finally processing the horrifying fact that the man she married had not only humiliated her personally, but systematically dismantled her parents' entire financial empire just to save his own skin. She realized her guaranteed inheritance, her luxurious safety net, and her flawless public image were tied to a $15 million black hole that could never be filled. The fairy tale life she continuously flaunted in my face to make me feel small was built on a mountain of highly toxic debt that her own father was now legally obligated to pay back in full. I turned my attention back to Trent. He was backed into the dark corner of the dining room, sweating profusely and shaking with absolute terror. I told him he was a brilliant manipulator for convincing a seasoned black business owner to voluntarily sign away his entire life work without asking a single verifying question. I said his arrogance was almost impressive until his desperate creditors realized the federal government was actively building a criminal case against him. I explained the commercial lending institution, holding my father's cross-collateralized loan, instantly panicked when they caught wind of the silent Securities and Exchange Commission investigation. I told the room that banking executives do not wait around for federal indictments to drop before they aggressively liquidate their toxic assets to protect their own bottom line. Trent realized the invisible walls were completely closing in around him, and his polished professional facade violently shattered. He let out a loud, desperate scream that sounded exactly like a cornered, wounded animal fighting for its very life. He forcefully shoved his way past Jasmine, knocking her hard against the sharp edge of the heavy mahogany dining table. He lunged blindly across the expensive living room carpet, sprinting directly toward the massive television screen mounted above the fireplace. He shouted loudly that he could fix the entire situation if everyone just calmed down and stopped overreacting to raw data. He reached out with his shaking hands, desperately trying to rip the silver USB drive out of the side port of the television. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he just needed a little more time to move offshore accounts around and pay the angry creditors back before the commercial bank initiated the final foreclosure protocols. Trent clawed frantically at the side of the television screen, his polished fingernails scratching loudly against the black plastic frame. He continued to scream that he just needed a few more days to liquidate his offshore assets and satisfy the commercial lending officers before they pulled the plug on his entire operation. I watched his pathetic public meltdown with a deep feeling of clinical detachment. I reached my hand into the dark interior of my structured leather tote bag. My fingers brushed against the smooth, heavy paper of the legal documents I had retrieved from my hidden wall safe earlier that morning. I pulled the thick bound stack of paperwork out into the warm light of the dining room. The bright red official seal of the Fulton County Superior Court was stamped heavily across the front page. I walked slowly back to my seat at the long mahogany table. I stood directly over the ridiculous tax optimization contract Trent had arrogantly dropped onto my dinner plate just an hour ago. I raised my arm and threw my heavy court-stamped folders down hard onto the polished wood. The heavy stack of legal documents landed squarely on top of his fraudulent agreement, completely burying his desperate manipulation under the crushing weight of my absolute authority. Trent froze instantly at the loud, sharp sound of the heavy paper hitting the table. He slowly turned his head away from the glowing screen, his eyes wide with a brand new level of sickening panic. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice incredibly calm as I delivered the final devastating blow to his fragile ego. I told Trent his desperate scramble for a little more time was completely pointless, because the traditional commercial banks no longer held a single fraction of his highly toxic debt. I looked around the quiet dining room, making sure every member of my family was listening to my exact words. I told them I did not drive all the way to this estate tonight to politely transfer my hard-earned wealth into a failing family trust. I announced with perfect chilling clarity that I came to dinner to personally deliver their official foreclosure notices. Brenda let out another muffled, horrifying gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. Warren slumped heavily against the back of his chair, his eyes darting frantically between my face and the thick red stamped folders resting on the table. I explained the ruthless, unfeeling efficiency of my corporate acquisitions department to my stunned family. I told them that when the commercial lenders panicked over the silent federal investigation, they desperately sought an immediate cash buyout to quickly wash their hands of Trent's impending criminal indictment. I said banking executives are incredibly predictable when they are terrified of federal exposure. I told Warren my financial technology company possessed a massive abundance of liquid capital and a highly aggressive mandate to acquire distressed assets. I explained that my platform did not just flag the catastrophic financial anomaly and walk away. I said we stepped in and quietly purchased the entire $15 million debt portfolio for pennies on the dollar through an anonymous, untraceable corporate entity. I watched Trent slowly realize the terrifying magnitude of his absolute defeat. His entire body began to tremble visibly as the reality of my words washed over him. I told him my anonymous shell corporation was now his sole undisputed creditor. I explained that I officially owned every single compromised asset tied to his failing private equity firm. I said I legally possessed the heavily mortgaged Miami penthouse, the luxury yacht, and the frozen offshore accounts that were currently under federal investigation. I told him I held the exclusive legal power to dictate the exact terms of his catastrophic financial ruin, and I had absolutely zero intention of offering him a single ounce of corporate mercy. I turned my undivided attention back to my parents, who were sitting in stunned, horrifying silence. I looked directly at Warren, who was staring at the red-stamped folders as if they were a live explosive device. I told my father that because he foolishly chose to cross-collateralize his entire generational wealth to blindly back his white son-in-law's fraudulent schemes, my corporate ownership extended directly to his assets as well. I explained the brutal, unyielding nature of the legal contract he had signed without reading. I told him that by purchasing the debt portfolio, my company acquired all the associated collateral attached to the original loan. I said I was now the sole legal proprietor of his entire logistics empire and his commercial trucking fleet. I told him the business he had spent decades building was now officially just another line item on my corporate balance sheet, waiting to be ruthlessly liquidated. I slowly shifted my gaze to Brenda, who was still actively hyperventilating in her velvet dining chair. Her perfectly curated world had completely collapsed in a matter of minutes. I looked down at my mother and delivered the final crushing reality of her desperate situation. I told her that the sweeping legal foreclosure extended to the very ground she was currently sitting on. I explained that the aggressive loan guarantee Warren signed included the actual physical deed to the sprawling Buckhead mansion. I said I officially held the exclusive property rights to the beautiful historic estate she loved, showing off to her wealthy friends at the country club. I told her the crystal chandeliers, the original artwork, and the formal dining room were all legally bound to my corporate holding company. Jasmine sat perfectly still at the table, looking like a hollow, empty shell of the arrogant golden child she had been just an hour ago. I told my older sister that the immense generational safety net she had always relied upon was officially gone forever. I explained that she could no longer hide behind her husband's fabricated wealth or our father's logistics empire, because I now owned every single piece of their shattered legacy. I said the $99 million valuation on the cover of the magazine was just the beginning of my financial reach. I told them I had systematically dismantled their entire arrogant kingdom, using the very same ruthless business tactics my father had always praised. I stood silently at the table, allowing the devastating absolute truth of my complete financial dominance to permanently crush the toxic hierarchy of our family. Trent clawed frantically at the side of the massive television screen, his polished fingernails scraping loudly against the hard black plastic frame. He screamed that he just needed a few more days to quietly liquidate his hidden offshore assets and satisfy the anxious commercial lending officers before they pulled the plug on his entire operation. I watched his pathetic public meltdown with a deep feeling of absolute clinical detachment. I turned my back on his chaotic display and walked purposefully toward my structured leather tote bag resting on the floor near my dining chair. I reached my hand deep into the dark interior of the expensive bag. My fingers brushed against the smooth, heavy paper of the legal documents I had securely retrieved from my hidden wall safe earlier that morning. I wrapped my hand around the thick, bound stack of paperwork and pulled it out into the warm, glowing light of the dining room. The bright red official seal of the Fulton County Superior Court was stamped heavily and unmistakably across the very front page of each individual packet. I walked slowly and deliberately back to my assigned seat at the long mahogany table. I stood directly over the ridiculous tax optimization contract Trent had arrogantly dropped onto my dinner plate just an hour ago. I raised my arm high and threw my heavy court-stamped folders down hard onto the polished wood. The thick stack of legal documents landed squarely on top of his fraudulent agreement, completely burying his desperate manipulation under the crushing physical weight of my absolute corporate authority. Trent froze instantly at the loud, sharp sound of the heavy paper hitting the dining table. His frantic scratching against the television bezel ceased entirely as he slowly turned his head away from the glowing screen. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with a brand new level of sickening, visceral terror. The entire room fell into a suffocating, dead silence, broken only by the ragged, frantic breathing coming from my mother and sister. I kept my posture perfectly straight and my voice incredibly calm as I prepared to deliver the final devastating blow to his fragile, shattered ego. I looked at Trent and told him his desperate scramble for a little more time was completely pointless because the traditional commercial banks no longer held a single fraction of his highly toxic debt. I let that specific realization hang in the heavy air for a moment, watching his mind race to comprehend the financial implications. I looked slowly around the quiet dining room, making absolutely sure every single member of my family was listening to my exact words. I told them I did not drive all the way to this estate tonight to politely sit at their table and transfer my hard-earned wealth into a failing family trust. I announced with perfect chilling clarity that I came to dinner to personally deliver their official foreclosure notices. Brenda let out another muffled, horrifying gasp, covering her mouth tightly with both of her trembling hands as tears finally began to spill over her perfectly applied makeup. Warren slumped heavily against the back of his chair, his eyes darting frantically between my unreadable face and the thick red stamped folders resting innocently on the table. I decided to explain the ruthless, unfeeling efficiency of my corporate acquisitions department to my stunned family so they could fully understand exactly how they lost their entire empire. I told them that when the commercial lenders panicked over the silent federal investigation, they desperately sought an immediate cash buyout to quickly wash their hands of Trent's impending criminal indictment. I said banking executives are incredibly predictable when they are terrified of massive federal exposure and public relations disasters. I told Warren my financial technology company possessed a massive abundance of liquid capital and a highly aggressive mandate to acquire distressed commercial assets across the region. I explained that my platform did not just flag the catastrophic financial anomaly within his son-in-law's firm and walk away. I said my internal acquisitions team stepped in and quietly purchased the entire $15 million debt portfolio for absolute pennies on the dollar through an anonymous, untraceable corporate holding entity. I watched Trent slowly realize the terrifying magnitude of his absolute defeat. His entire body began to tremble visibly as the dark, suffocating reality of my words washed completely over him. His tailored blue dress shirt was now dark with nervous sweat, and his confident Wall Street persona was entirely eradicated. I told him my anonymous shell corporation was now his sole undisputed creditor, holding absolute power over his financial future. I explained that I officially owned every single compromised asset tied to his failing private equity firm. I said I legally possessed the heavily mortgaged Miami penthouse, the luxury yacht, and the frozen offshore accounts that were currently under strict federal investigation. I told him I held the exclusive legal power to dictate the exact terms of his catastrophic financial ruin, and I had absolutely zero intention of offering him a single ounce of corporate mercy or debt forgiveness. I turned my undivided attention back to my parents, who were sitting in stunned, horrifying silence, unable to process the total destruction of their carefully curated, wealthy lifestyle. I looked directly at Warren, who was staring at the red-stamped folders, as if they were a live explosive device waiting to detonate. I told my father that because he foolishly chose to cross-collateralize his entire generational wealth to blindly back his white son-in-law's fraudulent schemes, my corporate ownership extended directly to his assets as well. I explained the brutal, unyielding nature of the legal contract he had signed without bothering to read the standard liability clauses. I told him that by purchasing the overarching debt portfolio, my company automatically acquired all the associated collateral legally attached to the original loan agreement. I said I was now the sole legal proprietor of his entire logistics empire and his massive commercial trucking fleet. I told him the business he had spent decades building and aggressively gatekeeping from me was now officially just another line item on my corporate balance sheet, waiting to be ruthlessly liquidated to satisfy the outstanding debt. I slowly shifted my gaze to Brenda, who was still actively hyperventilating in her velvet dining chair, desperately clutching the expensive fabric of her dress. Her perfectly curated world of country club luncheons and high society galas had completely collapsed into dust in a matter of mere minutes. I looked down at my mother and delivered the final crushing reality of her desperate, inescapable situation. I told her that the sweeping legal foreclosure extended far beyond the commercial logistics business and reached the very ground she was currently sitting on. I explained that the aggressive loan guarantee Warren signed included the actual physical deed to the sprawling Buckhead mansion. I said I officially held the exclusive property rights to the beautiful historic estate she loved, showing off to her wealthy friends. I told her the crystal chandeliers, the original artwork on the walls, and the formal dining room we were currently occupying were all legally bound to my corporate holding company. Jasmine sat perfectly still at the table, looking like a hollow, empty shell of the arrogant, entitled golden child she had been just an hour ago. The diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist suddenly looked like a pair of heavy financial handcuffs. I told my older sister that the immense generational safety net she had always arrogantly relied upon was officially gone, forever wiped out by the very man she married. I explained that she could no longer hide behind her husband's fabricated wealth or our father's logistics empire, because I now personally owned every single piece of their shattered legacy. I said the $99 million valuation on the cover of the magazine was just the beginning of my vast financial reach. I told them I had systematically dismantled their entire arrogant kingdom using the very same ruthless business tactics my father had always hypocritically praised. I stood silently at the head of the table, allowing the devastating absolute truth of my complete financial dominance to permanently crush the toxic hierarchy of our family once and for all. The crushing weight of my financial dominance settled over the dining room, leaving a toxic, suffocating atmosphere in its wake. The unified front my family had carefully maintained for decades completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before my eyes. Jasmine was the very first to break. The flawless golden child could no longer maintain her polished country club facade now that her entire social identity had been violently stripped away. She slowly turned her head away from the glowing television screen and locked her furious, tear-filled eyes directly onto her husband. Trent shrank back against the wall, trying desperately to put physical distance between himself and his enraged wife. Jasmine did not say a single word at first. She simply closed the physical gap between them in 3 quick, aggressive strides. She raised her right hand and slapped Trent across the face with such tremendous force that the sharp, cracking sound echoed loudly through the vaulted ceilings of the formal dining room. Trent stumbled sideways, clutching his reddening cheek in absolute shock. Jasmine unleashed a primal, deafening scream that shook the crystal chandeliers hanging above our heads. She beat her fists against his chest, demanding to know how he could possibly humiliate her in front of the entire city of Atlanta. She shrieked about the 24-year-old fitness model living in the Miami penthouse using the exact details I had just exposed. She yelled that she had sacrificed her own youth to build the perfect corporate image for his failing private equity firm, while he was busy spending their non-existent fortune on offshore accounts and a secret second life. Her voice grew increasingly ragged as she accused him of making her look like an absolute pathetic fool in front of her younger sister. Trent completely lost his terrified demeanor and aggressively shoved Jasmine's hands away from his expensive dress shirt. His own deep-seated rage finally boiled over, replacing his previous panic with vicious defensive cruelty. He screamed right back into his wife's face, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. He told Jasmine she was nothing but a shallow, greedy parasite who bled his bank accounts dry to fund her endless string of designer handbags and luxury vacations. He shouted that he had to embezzle that money just to keep up with the absurd financial expectations she placed on him to impress her snobby socialite friends. He did not stop there. Trent violently shifted his aggressive focus away from his sobbing wife and pointed a shaking finger directly at my father. He roared that Warren's outdated failing commercial trucking company was the actual heavy anchor dragging his entire investment fund straight to the bottom of the ocean. He loudly declared that the logistics business was already bleeding cash for months before he ever suggested the cross-collateralization agreement. He told Warren that signing that loan guarantee was the only thing keeping the family logistics empire from defaulting on its own massive pre-existing operational debts. Warren lunged forward, pushing himself away from the mahogany dining table with a sudden burst of violent, chaotic energy. He grabbed Trent by the collar of his blue dress shirt, shoving the younger man hard against the ornate marble fireplace. My father screamed that Trent was a worthless lying con artist who deliberately manipulated a vulnerable family business to save his own sinking ship. He yelled that he would personally ensure Trent spent the rest of his natural life rotting in a federal prison for orchestrating such a massive, sophisticated wire fraud scheme. Trent laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that completely lacked any real humor. He shoved my father backward, causing the older man to stumble awkwardly over the edge of a plush velvet armchair. Trent mocked Warren for being an incredibly naive, outdated dinosaur who handed over the keys to his entire generational wealth without even bothering to read a basic commercial lending contract. He said Warren was just a desperate aging man who cared far more about keeping up appearances at the golf course than actually doing the hard analytical work required to protect his own assets. Brenda could no longer sit passively in her dining chair watching the men in her family physically and verbally tear each other to shreds. She jumped to her feet and grabbed Warren's arm, desperately trying to pull him away from another physical altercation with Trent. She screamed at both of them to stop fighting before the neighbors heard the commotion and called the local authorities. Her primary concern, even in the absolute total destruction of her life, was still maintaining the fragile illusion of their perfect, wealthy Southern reputation to the outside world. Jasmine dropped to her knees on the expensive hardwood floor, completely overcome by a violent, aggressive sobbing fit. She cried out that her life was entirely over, and that the elite women at the country club would completely destroy her social standing by morning. She wailed that she would have to file for a humiliating public bankruptcy and move out of her beautiful luxury estate. She blamed Trent for ruining her perfect future, and she blamed Warren for being stupid enough to lose the family money to a blatant white-collar criminal. The entire dining room descended into a horrific, deafening, chaotic symphony of pure, toxic dysfunction. The elegant, formal dinner setting was completely desecrated by the vicious, hateful things they were screaming at each other. They traded decades' worth of hidden resentments, bitter jealousies, and deeply buried insecurities. They blamed each other for the massive financial collapse, entirely refusing to take a single ounce of personal accountability for their own profound greed and blind arrogance. They tore into each other's deepest vulnerabilities, using the intimate knowledge they had gathered over a lifetime, just to inflict maximum emotional damage upon one another. I stood silently at the edge of the room, perfectly still, and completely untouched by the raging storm of their violent implosion. I simply watched them brutally cannibalize the very same family loyalty they had tried to weaponize against me just a few short hours earlier. The raw viciousness of their mutual destruction confirmed every single suspicion I always held about their conditional love. They were finally ripping apart the fake, pristine image they had spent their entire lives vigorously protecting, and I never lifted a single finger to help them out in any way. The crushing weight of my financial dominance settled over the dining room, leaving a toxic, suffocating atmosphere in its wake. The unified front my family had carefully maintained for decades completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces right before my eyes. Jasmine was the very first to break. The flawless golden child could no longer maintain her polished country club facade now that her entire social identity had been violently stripped away. She slowly turned her head away from the glowing television screen and locked her furious, tear-filled eyes directly onto her husband. Trent shrank back against the wall, trying desperately to put physical distance between himself and his enraged wife. Jasmine did not say a single word at first. She simply closed the physical gap between them in 3 quick, aggressive strides. She raised her right hand and slapped Trent across the face with such tremendous force that the sharp, cracking sound echoed loudly through the vaulted ceilings of the formal dining room. Trent stumbled sideways, clutching his reddening cheek in absolute shock. Jasmine unleashed a primal, deafening scream that shook the crystal chandeliers hanging above our heads. She beat her fists against his chest, demanding to know how he could possibly humiliate her in front of the entire city of Atlanta. She shrieked about the 24-year-old fitness model living in the Miami penthouse, using the exact details I had just exposed. She yelled that she had sacrificed her own youth to build the perfect corporate image for his failing private equity firm, while he was busy spending their non-existent fortune on offshore accounts and a secret second life. Her voice grew increasingly ragged as she accused him of making her look like an absolute pathetic fool in front of her younger sister. Trent completely lost his terrified demeanor and aggressively shoved Jasmine's hands away from his expensive dress shirt. His own deep-seated rage finally boiled over, replacing his previous panic with vicious defensive cruelty. He screamed right back into his wife's face, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. He told Jasmine she was nothing but a shallow, greedy parasite who bled his bank accounts dry to fund her endless string of designer handbags and luxury vacations. He shouted that he had to embezzle that money just to keep up with the absurd financial expectations she placed on him to impress her snobby socialite friends. He did not stop there. Trent violently shifted his aggressive focus away from his sobbing wife and pointed a shaking finger directly at my father. He roared that Warren's outdated, failing commercial trucking company was the actual heavy anchor dragging his entire investment fund straight to the bottom of the ocean. He loudly declared that the logistics business was already bleeding cash for months before he ever suggested the cross-collateralization agreement. He told Warren that signing that loan guarantee was the only thing keeping the family logistics empire from defaulting on its own massive pre-existing operational debts. Warren lunged forward, pushing himself away from the mahogany dining table with a sudden burst of violent, chaotic energy. He grabbed Trent by the collar of his blue dress shirt, shoving the younger man hard against the ornate marble fireplace. My father screamed that Trent was a worthless, lying con artist who deliberately manipulated a vulnerable family business to save his own sinking ship. He yelled that he would personally ensure Trent spent the rest of his natural life rotting in a federal prison for orchestrating such a massive, sophisticated wire fraud scheme. Trent laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that completely lacked any real humor. He shoved my father backward, causing the older man to stumble awkwardly over the edge of a plush velvet armchair. Trent mocked Warren for being an incredibly naive, outdated dinosaur who handed over the keys to his entire generational wealth without even bothering to read a basic commercial lending contract. He said Warren was just a desperate aging man who cared far more about keeping up appearances at the golf course than actually doing the hard analytical work required to protect his own assets. Brenda could no longer sit passively in her dining chair, watching the men in her family physically and verbally tear each other to shreds. She jumped to her feet and grabbed Warren's arm, desperately trying to pull him away from another physical altercation with Trent. She screamed at both of them to stop fighting before the neighbors heard the commotion and called the local authorities. Her primary concern, even in the absolute total destruction of her life, was still maintaining the fragile illusion of their perfect, wealthy Southern reputation to the outside world. Jasmine dropped to her knees on the expensive hardwood floor, completely overcome by a violent, aggressive sobbing fit. She cried out that her life was entirely over and that the elite women at the country club would completely destroy her social standing by morning. She wailed that she would have to file for a humiliating public bankruptcy and move out of her beautiful luxury estate. She blamed Trent for ruining her perfect future, and she blamed Warren for being stupid enough to lose the family money to a blatant white-collar criminal. The entire dining room descended into a horrific, deafening, chaotic symphony of pure toxic dysfunction. The elegant, formal dinner setting was completely desecrated by the vicious, hateful things they were screaming at each other. They traded decades' worth of hidden resentments, bitter jealousies, and deeply buried insecurities. They blamed each other for the massive financial collapse, entirely refusing to take a single ounce of personal accountability for their own profound greed and blind arrogance. They tore into each other's deepest vulnerabilities, using the intimate knowledge they had gathered over a lifetime, just to inflict maximum emotional damage upon one another. I stood silently at the edge of the room, perfectly still and completely untouched by the raging storm of their violent implosion. I simply watched them brutally cannibalize the very same family loyalty they had tried to weaponize against me just a few short hours earlier. The raw viciousness of their mutual destruction confirmed every single suspicion I always held about their conditional love. They were finally ripping apart the fake pristine image they had spent their entire lives vigorously protecting, and I never lifted a single finger to help them out in any way. The chaotic symphony of screaming and shattered glass, echoing from the formal dining room, no longer holds any interest for me. The absolute total destruction of their toxic hierarchy is completely finalized and requires no further participation on my part. I turn my back on the violent implosion without uttering another single word to any of them. The heavy mahogany table and the spilled red wine simply fade into the background as I walk away from the wreckage of their fragile egos. I move down the wide, brightly lit hallway toward the grand foyer, measuring my steps with the exact same calm, deliberate precision I use when exiting a highly successful corporate board meeting. My tailored emerald green suit remains perfectly crisp and untouched by the emotional warfare tearing through the back of the house. My heels click with a steady rhythmic cadence against the imported marble floor, signaling my definitive departure. I stop right next to the heavy oak front door, taking a moment to observe the quiet elegance of the entryway. The ridiculous tax optimization contract Trent had arrogantly presented to me earlier is resting precariously on the edge of a small decorative console table. I reach out and pick up the thick stack of premium paper. The legal document feels incredibly light and entirely meaningless in my hands. I grip the top edge of the binding and pull my hands forcefully apart, tearing the fraudulent agreement perfectly down the middle. The sharp, distinct sound of ripping paper echoes briefly in the quiet foyer, representing the final physical severing of my ties to this deeply broken family. I drop the shredded pieces of the contract directly into the sleek metal trash receptacle, sitting discreetly next to the front door, leaving their desperate manipulation exactly where it belongs. I reach forward and push the heavy brass handle of the front door, pushing it wide open into the dark night. The cool, crisp air of the Atlanta evening immediately washes over my face, sweeping away the suffocating toxic warmth of the mansion. I step out onto the sprawling stone porch and take a deep, long, cleansing breath. The massive brick estate standing behind me is no longer an intimidating monument to my childhood rejection and endless parental disappointment. It is now merely another highly distressed asset listed on my corporate balance sheet, waiting to be aggressively and systematically liquidated by my financial teams. I walk down the wide stone steps, moving with absolute unbothered grace and absolute certainty. The manicured lawns and the towering old oak trees begin to blur into the dark shadows of the affluent neighborhood. My private security team is waiting quietly and professionally near the circular driveway exactly where I instructed them to be. My lead driver stands perfectly straight beside the sleek black frame of my customized Maybach. He pulls the heavy armored passenger door wide open as soon as I approach, offering a highly respectful professional nod. I slide smoothly into the plush leather seating of the luxurious vehicle, embracing the dark, quiet comfort of the interior. The driver closes the heavy door, securing me inside a completely soundproof sanctuary, away from the chaotic screaming that is likely still echoing through the dining room. The powerful silent engine purrs to life, and the long, elegant car begins to glide smoothly down the wide, winding stone driveway. I settle back into the soft cushions and look out the tinted passenger window, watching the towering wrought iron gates of the Buckhead estate automatically swing open to let me pass through for the very last time. I shift my gaze to the rectangular rearview mirror mounted above the dashboard. The glowing warm lights of my father's mansion slowly shrink into the distance, growing smaller and smaller against the dark night sky. I watch the imposing columns and the manicured hedges blur into mere silhouettes until they finally disappear completely as the car turns smoothly onto the main road, heading back toward the city. I do not feel a single ounce of remorse, guilt, or sadness for the brutal financial execution I just delivered to my own blood relatives. The heavy, suffocating weight of constantly seeking their validation and endlessly begging for their approval is completely gone, replaced entirely by a profound, unshakable sense of genuine, absolute freedom. The bright, colorful city lights of downtown Atlanta begin to illuminate the horizon ahead of me, reflecting brightly against the dark-tinted windows of the vehicle. The urban skyline stands tall and proud, serving as a shining monument to the vast commercial kingdom I have successfully conquered. I reach down into my structured leather tote bag and pull out my secure corporate smartphone. The bright digital screen illuminates my calm face in the dark cabin. My executive dashboard is loaded, displaying real-time data analytics and transaction volumes for my financial technology platform. I open the highly encrypted messaging portal to review the latest urgent brief sent directly by my chief operating officer. The text outlines a lucrative opportunity to acquire a struggling payment processing firm, losing market share to our innovative software. I read through the complex projected revenue models, the dense risk assessment portfolios, and the aggressive corporate restructuring plans with a sharp, clear analytical focus. The numbers presented on the screen align perfectly with my long-term strategic vision for expanding our absolute market dominance across the entire southeastern United States. I tap the smooth glass screen with my index finger, officially authorizing the multi-million-dollar acquisition without a single second of hesitation or creeping doubt. The digital confirmation notification flashes a bright green across the display, signaling another expansion of my growing corporate empire. I lock the phone screen, plunging the back seat of the car into a comfortable, soothing darkness once again. I place the mobile device gently on the soft leather seat beside me. I lean my head back against the plush headrest and close my eyes, allowing the gentle rocking motion of the ride to completely relax my tense muscles. The quiet, powerful hum of the luxury car carries me smoothly toward my spectacular midtown penthouse, far away from the toxic, burning ruins of my past life. I listen to the steady, rhythmic sound of the heavy tires rolling fast against the asphalt, feeling entirely, profoundly, and unconditionally at peace with the ruthless, beautiful empire I built completely on my own terms.